Chapter 11. That night, sewers beneath Seraiti. In a small corner room in the darkness of the sewers, Ichigo lay on the ground. The boy had been put to sleep by Hanataro so that the boy could get to work healing him. He was a little apprehensive of Hanataro's offer to put him asleep at first, not wanting the boy to just hand him over to the Soul Reapers. But seeing the determination and kindness in Hanataro's eyes told Ichigo that he could be trusted, and he let the medic work his magic, putting him to sleep while he healed his injuries. While Ichigo wasn't seriously wounded, he'd lost a lot of blood from his subsequent battles which needed to be replenished. While Hanataro went to work healing his body, Ichigo's mind drifted to farther places, dreaming of a certain someone. The cool wind disturbed Ichigo's rest. Opening his eyes, he found himself lying on a small lawn chair next to a pool. Hearing splashing, he sat up and saw someone climb out of the water. Ichigo's jaw hit the floor when he saw Halibel, bereft of her hollow fragments and wearing a white bikini that left little to the imagination. Halibel, he breathed before remembering his fight with Renji. Am I dreaming? He asked. Yes, Halibel replied as she approached Ichigo. Oh, Ichigo sat back in the chair disappointed. He really wished he was with Halibel. After the past few battles he'd had, he could really use her guidance right now. Smiling, Halibel walked around Ichigo's chair and stood behind him. Touching his shoulders, she leaned down and kissed his forehead. But it is a good dream. Her hand traced his shoulder, the spot where Renji had wounded him. I see you let your aggression get the better of you. Ichigo turned away, ashamed of himself. He'd thought he'd learned his lesson about being overconfident, but he was just as naive as ever. I was stupid. Renji goaded me into giving into my rage. I thought for sure that I was stronger than him. Wrapping her arms around his shoulders, Halibel pressed her nose into Ichigo's hair and breathed in his strong scent. You're young and inexperienced, Ichigo. You've yet to master your emotions. With time, you can learn to shut out your useless aggression. You should learn to control your emotions, she told him before smirking. Perhaps you're in need of some self-restraint right now. The two lay back in the chair, panting heavily. Turning her head, Halibel kissed Ichigo sweetly one more time. Don't forget, Ichigo. You promised to come back to me. Halibel, Ichigo. The boy awoke from a shaking on his arm. Opening his eyes, he saw Hanataro kneeling over him. It's morning. We need to get moving. Ichigo sat up and sighed, knowing it had all been just a dream. He checked himself and was relieved to see that he didn't have a sticky surprise in his pants and sat up. He flexed his shoulder and was relieved to feel no pain. Good work, Hanataro, he praised. Hanataro beamed with pride, but he had one question though. Ichigo, who's Halibel? He couldn't help but ask. You kept saying the name in your sleep. Turning red with embarrassment, Ichigo turned away. She's just a friend. Anyway, we need to go. Hanataro followed him back to the entrance. He couldn't help but smile at Ichigo's embarrassment. She must be a good friend. He was smiling every time he said her name. Chapter 12. Much later, Ichigo opened his eyes, the pain in his stomach waking him up. Where am I? He saw that he was in a small dark room and sat up, hunching over in pain. What happened? His memory started to come back to him. After recovering from his fight with Renji, he and Hanataro continued their trek to Rukia's prison cell, only to be intercepted by the captain of Squad 11, Kenpachi Zaraki. Telling Hanataro to go on ahead, Ichigo engaged the psychotic captain. After a series of ups and downs, including being stabbed in the chest and being forced to fight his own dark shadow, Ichigo managed to fight Kenpachi to a draw, blacking out after getting stabbed in the stomach. Something that worried Ichigo was the dark shadow Ichigo had to fight in order for Zangetsu to lend him his strength again. The shadow's spiritual pressure was very similar to that of Halibel's. Finally awake, When Ichigo turned around, he saw the familiar talking black cat trotting up to him. Yoruichi, you saved me. Ichigo asked. You can thank your own will to live. A lesser man would have died instantly from those injuries. When Ichigo tried to get up, the cat bristled. Don't move, you're in no condition to get up. The cat warned. I have to go. Chad and Ganju. During the battle with Kenpachi, Ichigo felt his two friends get taken down. I've gotta help them. He was stopped though when Yoruichi bopped him in the face with a paw. Calm down, the cat told him. They're alive, as are Orihime and Ryu. They fought the right people. Just lie back in the force field and rest, Yoruichi ordered. Wait, Yoruichi, Ichigo suddenly had a question. How do you manage to carry me here with such a tiny body? The cat scoffed. It wasn't too hard in my original form. You're quite light for someone with a lot of muscle. Wait, true form. Ichigo blinked. Yes, I've kept it from you this whole time, but since there's no point in hiding it, Yoruichi's body began to glow. I'll show you, my true form. Yoruichi disappeared in a puff of smoke. When he reappeared, Ichigo was stunned beyond belief. Because he was a she. In truth, Yoruichi reminded Ichigo very much of Halibel, with her dark skin and piercing eyes. Her hair, purple like lavender, sprawled down her front. Ichigo stared at the woman in all her glory. Though she wasn't quite as stacked as Halibel, she did have a pretty ample bosom and legs that didn't seem to end. Surprised, Yoruichi asked, clearly expecting Ichigo's stunned reaction. Most folks assume I'm a man by the sound of my voice in my cat form. Revealing my true form is always a delight, she chuckled. I love getting everyone's reactions. So this is who you really are? Ichigo asked, staring in awe at her naked body. Why yes It was then that Yoruichi realized she was naked. Whoops, I tend to forget that I'm naked in my cat form. I haven't worn clothes in a long time. She walked over to a crate and grabbed some clothes. As she put them on, she noticed something though. You know, she turned back to Ichigo, who was watching her intently. I was thinking you'd react a bit more prudish. What gave you that impression? Oh, you kind of come across as a bore, Yoruichi said bluntly, much to Ichigo's chagrin. Cracking a smile, she turned back to Ichigo as she put some pants on. So tell me, was that the first time you've seen a woman naked before? Second, Ichigo said before realizing it. Yoruichi continued to smile. 15 and you've already seen a woman naked. And from the look on your face, she said while narrowing her eyes. I'd say you've done more than seen a woman naked. When Ichigo blushed and looked away, she knew she'd hit the mark. Oh my, 15 and you've already gone to bed with a girl. Tell me, who is it? She teased. Is it Orihime? No, we're just friends. Ah, I'm sure she'll be heartbroken to hear that, Yoruichi said. Even though she was teasing, she decided to dig a little deeper. She still wanted to know what it was that Ichigo was keeping from her and Kazuki and felt that this might help solve the riddle. Was it your best friend, Tatsuki? Or one of your other classmates? What? No, Ichigo sputtered, suddenly feeling hot under the collar from having this woman dig into his love life. Anyway, how'd you carry me here? Yoruichi showed him the gadgets she used to carry the boy to safety. Yet the more Ichigo heard, the more it made him question his ally. Yoruichi, you can change forms. You heal wounds and you've all sorts of gizmos. Just who exactly are you? Yoruichi stared at the boy intently for a moment before reaching into her pocket to pull something she grabbed off Ichigo's person. The better question is, she held up the bracelet. Who exactly are you? The interrogation was interrupted when they felt a massive burst of spirit pressure. This spiritual pressure, Yoruichi gasped. It's him, Ichigo said, recognizing the presence of the man who'd robbed him of his powers. As quickly as he could he got up, enduring the pain in his stomach. Ichigo, no, Yoruichi protested. He's going after Hanataro and Rukia. He insisted. If I don't go, who else can save them? He asked, grabbing her flight gadget. Yoruichi watched him fly away into the distance and cursed the boy's impetuousness. Fool. Pocketing the bracelet she lifted from Ichigo, she followed him towards Rukia's cell, hoping she wasn't too late. Much later, Fwa, Ichigo breathed as he sank into the hot spring, relaxing after a long day of training. This feels so good. To say that Ichigo's rescue attempt was disastrous was an understatement. Although he managed to reach Rukia and Hanataro in time to keep Byakuya from murdering the Squad 4 healer, Yoruichi arrived and broke up the fight before Byakuya could release his Zanpakuto. Despite Ichigo's insistence to leave the fight to him, Yoruichi shoved a drug into Ichigo's open wound to knock him out, carrying him away before Byakuya could kill all of them. When he recovered, Ichigo's anger was abated when Yoruichi told him of a way to become stronger in 3 days. She took him to a cave similar to the one Kazuki had under his shop and explained Bankai to the boy before letting him begin his training. He noticed that his wounds began to heal the more he sat in the water. Hey, what kind of hot spring is this? Incredible. He dunked his head underwater to heal the cuts on his face. When he came back up for air he saw Yoruichi standing at the edge of the spring. How's the water? It feels amazing, Ichigo breathed, sitting back. Good, you've earned it. Yoruichi reached for her own clothes. I think I'll have a soak too. She stripped in front of Ichigo and sat down next to him in the hot spring. So then, she leaned uncomfortably close to Ichigo, giving him bedroom eyes. Why don't you tell me more about this mystery girl of yours? Perhaps you can show me a little of what you gave her. Ichigo felt really hot, and not because of the hot spring. As much as he liked the offer, he could tell that Yoruichi was still prying into his private affairs. I have something I need to ask you, he said, hoping to get the perverted werecat from prying further. This room reminds me a lot of the room beneath Urahara's shop. Sitting back, Yoruichi nodded. I imagined it would. He based it off this room after all. It was, of course. This was mine and Kazuki's secret playground. He built it secretly underneath the Sokyoku hill. How'd he, secretly, build something this big? Kazuki's always been crafty. Ichigo frowned. I knew it. I knew he was a soul reaper. He knew too much about this place for it to be coincidence. Yes, he was a former captain actually. He was the captain of Squad 12 and the creator of its R&D department. He's always kept himself at a distance to everyone. Why didn't he tell me? Ichigo asked. It wasn't important. He has his reasons. Like I said, he's crafty. The two sat in silence before Yoruichi turned to the boy next to her. What was that bracelet, Ichigo? She asked bluntly. Why do you want to know? The werecat's golden eyes narrowed. She knew that Ichigo was on the defense and knew that she couldn't afford to lose his trust by future prying. Never mind, I can tell that it's personal. Thank you, Ichigo said, grateful for his friend not prying too deeply. He didn't have a good excuse for the bracelet, so he was afraid he might trip over his own words. Now then, Yoruichi leaned forward again, her lips inching closer and closer to Ichigo's. Why don't I show you my skills? She teased. She knew that most men couldn't resist her charms. But Ichigo was not most men, and as badly as he wanted to accept, he just couldn't. He pushed her away and shook his head. I'm sorry, but his mind drifted to that night with Halibel under the fireworks. I like someone else. Yoruichi was surprised. Rare was the man who rejected her advances. Whoever this girl is, Ichigo must really care for her. That or she has a better body than mine. Finding a new respect for the boy, Yoruichi backed away, giving him a courteous nod before standing up. You should get out soon and get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be tougher than today. Ichigo watched her go before sinking back down into the water. Looking down at his reflection, he couldn't help but think about his secret mentor, wishing she was here to help him. Halibel, Chapter 13. 2 days later. Sokyoku Hill. Everything Ichigo had gone through had led to this moment, the final showdown with his enemy, Rukia's older brother, Byakuya Kuchiki. His black blade, the embodiment of his Bankai, Tensa Zangetsu, clashed with the man as he engaged the captain in a fast and furious duel. Ichigo had arrived at just the last second to save Rukia, stopping the giant firebird with his Zanpakuto. After Rukia's superior officer, Captain Yukitaki, and his ally Kyoraku destroyed the Sokyoku, Ichigo tossed Rukia to Renji, who'd arrived after recovering from his defeat at the hands of Byakuya. After dispatching multiple lieutenants barehanded, Ichigo engaged Byakuya Kuchiki in open combat, their final battle beginning. Though Ichigo got the upper hand with his Zangetsu's special ability, the Getsuga Tensho, Byakuya showed him how outclassed he was when he unleashed his Bankai, Senbon Sakura Kujiyoshi. Although Byakuya glowered in his impending victory, Ichigo surprised him by revealing he'd achieved Bankai himself, unleashing his sword's final form, Tensa Zangetsu. And yet, something felt off. As he dodged and evaded Byakuya's blades, Ichigo felt something stir within him. He didn't have time to dwell on it, but in the back of his mind, he started to feel afraid. Ichigo unleashed the full speed of his enhanced power, catching Byakuya by surprise. You said I wouldn't get another miracle. So what's this? he asked before he slashed Byakuya in the chest. Though he staggered backwards, Byakuya was still determined to strike down the impudent boy. So I see. So that is your Bankai's power. Byakuya's eyes gleamed with bloodlust as he glared at Ichigo. Then I'll crush that power and you along with it. The blood dripping from Byakuya's wound glowed white as he summoned his petal blades. Behold, this is Senbon Sakura's true form, when it has abandoned all defense and commits itself only to killing an enemy, Byakuya proclaimed. Senki. Senbon Sakura Kageyoshi. The two combatants were surrounded by a cage of glowing pink swords. Byakuya reached out with his hand and a sword appeared in it. He saw the frightened look on Ichigo's face and stepped closer. Don't be afraid. The swords will not attack you, he told the boy. However, he was wrong about what was scaring the teen. The dark stirring inside Ichigo grew. In addition, his body started to feel strained, the fatigue of his non-stop fights setting in. He recognized the sensation. It was the same feeling that he felt when he fought his shadow and when he was with Halibel. Byakuya saw the boy stumble and was confused. He didn't judge the boy to be frightened so easily and could tell something was wrong. What is the matter? He asked as he slumped forward. When Ichigo didn't answer, Byakuya decided to end the fight once and for all. He thought for a moment that Ichigo was setting him up with a feint but went in for the kill anyway. This ends here. He lunged forward and brought his sword down to cut through Ichigo's head like a melon. But Ichigo surprised him when he moved. He didn't bring his black blade up to block though. Instead, Ichigo stunned the captain when he reached out with his bare hand and caught his glowing blade. What? You fool, said the boy in a dark, mysterious voice. Throwing yourself into a fight you can't possibly win. What would your girlfriend think? How? Byakuya gawked. Who are you? When Ichigo looked up, his eyes widened with horror. The boy's eyes were black and yellow, and growing on the side of his face was a hollow mask. Who am I? I have no name. Meanwhile, Hawako Mundo, Halibel's room. Inside her room, Halibel was sleeping, resting comfortably on a huge bed. Her rest was disturbed, however, when she suddenly opened her eyes and sat up. She didn't know why but she could sense something terrible. Something had happened to Ichigo. Getting out of bed, Halibel tried to shake the feeling she'd woken up to. Despite the fact that her student was literally worlds away, Halibel felt a dark shift in the air, as if something unnatural had been awakened. What's happened? She asked herself. Then she remembered something she'd neglected to think about. When she met Ichigo after his training, she noticed something different about him. At first she thought it was just his increased strength but his spiritual pressure felt darker, much like a hollow's. Halibel gasped as a revelation hit her. She cursed her lack of insight. She hadn't thought about exactly how Kazuki Urahara helped him get his powers back. There was only one recourse since he'd lost his Soul Reaper powers and that was to make him undergo hollowification. She didn't know how but she knew that the boy was in danger from himself. She squeezed her fists, cursing her helplessness. She hated herself for not going to help him, her cheeks burning from her cowardice. Ichigo, she whispered as she sat down in her chair. Please be safe. But for now, all the Arrancar could do was wait. Much later, Sokyoku Hill, Ichigo stood next to Renji as they stared down the traitorous captain, Sasuke Aizen, and his two compatriots, Jin Ichimaru and Konami Tosen. Though Ichigo had been victorious with one battle, he'd ended up fighting another one right after. His fight with Byakuya had become interrupted when his inner hollow took over, fighting the captain blow for blow. The hollow feed Ichigo managed to get in a critical hit with a black Getsuga Tensho before Ichigo fought for control of his body back. Byakuya watched in amazement as Ichigo endured a mental Jekyll Hyde struggle for his own body before coming back to the forefront to finish the fight. The two unleashed their final attacks and Ichigo ended up the victor. Byakuya, taking too deep a wound, dropped to his knees and gave the fight to Ichigo, telling him to finish him off so that he could die with what dignity he had. But Ichigo refused. It wasn't Byakuya who was his enemy, after all, but the law of the Soul Society. Touched by Ichigo's drive, Byakuya agreed to not pursue Rukia anymore before collapsing. Reunited with his friends, Ichigo let Orihime heal his wounds before they were contacted by one of the lieutenants who informed them of the mastermind behind Rukia's execution, Sasuke Aizen. Sensing them back up on the Sokyoku Hill, Ichigo raced back up and saved Renji and Rukia before Aizen could kill them. "You ready, Ichigo?" Renji asked while he prepared his final attack. "This move will only work once, but if it hits, Aizen will be vulnerable." Ichigo prepared himself. He'd mostly recovered his strength thanks to Orihime and he was ready to strike down his man. He took Halibel's lesson to heart. This was the man who'd been the cause of much of his grief. Ichigo would show him no quarter. Making a stance, Renji gathered what strength he had. "This is gonna sting, Zabumaru. Just grit your teeth and bear with it." He stabbed the broken sword into the ground. Higa Zeko. The broken pieces of Zabumaru that lay around Aizen glowed red before rising up. Before Aizen could react, the blades converged on him, the man disappearing in a cloud of dust. Seeing his chance, Ichigo charged forward before they even hit their mark, certain that his speed wouldn't fail him. Reaching Aizen, he swung with all his might. Aizen caught it with his bare hand. Ichigo was stunned. He couldn't believe what was happening. How was Aizen that strong? The captain took a swing at the exposed Ichigo, but the boy's reflexes were sharp enough to help him dodge the blow, narrowly avoiding being cut in half. Aizen let go of Ichigo's sword and noted the tiny cut on his palm. He gave the boy a chilling smile. "She taught you well," he praised. Ichigo blinked in surprise. "What?" Shunk. An intense pain filled Ichigo's innards. Looking down, he saw Aizen's sword sticking out of his stomach. His head turned in horror to see Aizen standing directly behind him. Ichigo had never even seen him move. But not good enough. Pulling his sword out of Ichigo, Aizen watched the boy crumple to the ground before turning his attention to Rukia and Renji. Ichigo could do nothing but lay on the ground as he watched events progress, unable to even move. Ichigo watched as Aizen cut down Renji and moved to obtain his prime objective from Rukia, an object hidden inside her Konpaku by Kazuki called the Hogyoku. Captain Komamura attempted to stop him, but even he was defeated with a single spell. Aizen extracted the Hogyoku from Rukia, leaving Jin to finish her off. Byakuya arrived and took the blow in her place, saving his sister. The other captains arrived, but even they failed to keep the traitors from escaping. Helped by the Manos of Hueco Mundo, Aizen and his allies were lifted up by their negation. Discarding his glasses, Aizen took one last look at his enemies as he stood with his minions. "Farewell, Soul Reapers." His eyes turned to the defeated Ichigo. "Goodbye, Ryoka boy, you were most interesting for a human." Ichigo watched the man leave before grimacing, his mind turning back to what Aizen had said. "She taught you well." Ichigo's hand squeezed into fists. "Halibel," he groaned. Aizen's words had left him feeling betrayed. "Whose side are you on?" Chapter 14. The next day. Squad 13. Ichigo sat next to the window, watching the moon rise in the dark sky, night having fallen upon the Soul Society. His hand would often go to his stomach, feeling the scar left by Aizen's sword. Orihime had healed him, but the scar still remained, a reminder of his defeat. His friends slept in their own private rooms provided by Rukia's commanding officer, Captain Yukitaki. Now that Aizen's treachery was exposed, Rukia's death penalty had been lifted, the head captain apologizing to the girl for so blindly following Central 46's orders. Ichigo was grateful that his friends weren't hurt badly. Chad was still a little injured from his fight with Kiraku, but he'd recover. Sitting in the dark room, Ichigo continued to stare out at the night. Everything felt so serene. Everything, except for Ichigo. Ichigo's thoughts were in turmoil. The most pressing issue was his inner hollow. Despite pushing him back down into his subconscious, Ichigo could still feel him deep inside his soul. Every once in a while he could feel a dark shiver course through him, as if the creature would take over at any moment. He felt vulnerable and alone. He couldn't tell his friends and burden him with his problem. Not for the first time, he wished that his mentor was here. More importantly, Ichigo wanted answers. Aizen's words had shaken him up. It was very clear to Ichigo that he was aware of Ichigo's relationship to Halibel, and it made Ichigo question Halibel's motives. She'd told him when they first met that her reasons for training Ichigo were her own, but not once did she ever tell him what her own reasons were, which led Ichigo to wonder if Halibel's reasons were actually Aizen's. "I wish she was here so I could ask her," Ichigo muttered, wondering if now Halibel was his enemy. He heard a knock at the door and turned as it opened. Sitting in the dark. "That's not like you," Rukia teased, turning on the light. Oh, hey, Rukia. I couldn't sleep. Rukia sat down on the bed next to him. She wore a kimono supplied by her brother, who'd apologized to Rukia for his actions. The two remained silent for a while before Rukia worked up the courage to ask him something she'd wanted to ask for weeks. Ichigo, can I ask you something? Ichigo turned to see that Rukia had a serious face. What is it? Who was that woman I saw you with? The night that I was captured by Byakuya and Renji, you were sparring with a hollow. Ichigo's eyes widened in surprise. He'd no idea that Rukia had spied on them while they were sparring. Filled with shame at his deceit, Ichigo turned away. I'm sorry, I didn't know how to tell you. Rukia put a hand on his arm, giving him a gentle smile. She knew that this was clearly deeply personal to Ichigo, but she knew that it was time for the boy to tell the truth for once. You can tell me now. Sighing, Ichigo turned back to Rukia and confessed to everything. He told her about the night he met Halibel and how she trained him, letting him get revenge on Grand Fisher, and even about their romantic night during the festival. He even apologized for using the sleeping powder on Rukia. Well, I had thought that something was up. You were growing too strong for it to be just coincidence. But Ichigo, her smile disappeared and her tone grew more serious. This is going to be a problem. It's obvious that she's one of Aizen's soldiers. Ichigo scowled. He knew how this might look to one of the captains. Are you going to tell the others? Rukia shook her head. No, I can tell that you trust her, Ichigo. From the way you described her, she doesn't sound like she was trying to brainwash you. So I'll keep quiet for now. But Ichigo, she grew more concerned. I don't know what will happen if the captains learn of this. Sweat dripped down the side of Ichigo's head as more dread filled his heart. Considering their treatment of Rukia just for saving his life, he'd no doubt their punishment for his crime of associating with Halibel would be severe. I don't know what to do, he admitted. I don't think she's my enemy, but... Silence filled the room again. Rukia didn't know what to tell her friend. She trusted his judgment, but this was still a serious matter. Just remember, the next time you meet her, you're enemies now. Ichigo couldn't help but sigh, knowing deep down that she was right. I know. Rukia could tell this was weighing heavily on his shoulders. Knowing there was no easy answer for him, she patted his shoulder. Get some rest, she told him as she got up. You need your rest. Ichigo watched her leave before lying down in bed. It had felt good to finally confess to someone about his relationship with Halibel, but the doubt still remained in his mind. Turning over, Ichigo fell into a restless sleep, feeling the call of his inner hollow from deep within. Days later, Karakura Town, Ichigo's room. Ichigo lay on his own bed. He'd been through so much that it felt foreign to him. It was hard to go from a life or death rescue mission to his normal life, even with his normal hollow hunting. Though he was disappointed that Rukia did not return with him and his friends, he understood that she was a soul reaper and belonged in the soul society. Khan was devastated, but Ichigo didn't really care. He was dozing off to sleep when he glanced at the bracelet around his wrist. Yoruichi had given it back, stating that she could wait until Ichigo was ready to tell her what it was, though from the look in her eye Ichigo surmised that she figured out it was a communication device. He was glad that she didn't hand it over to Kazuki at least. Speaking of Kazuki, Ichigo had grown to be more distrustful of the shopkeeper. Although the man had apologized for all that he put Ichigo and Rukia through, Ichigo had not quite forgiven him for leaving him in the dark about so many things. He wanted to vent his anger at Kazuki at the time, but held his tongue since he really just wanted to go home. The boy went rigid when he saw the jewel in the bracelet turn green. She's here. At once Ichigo felt both elated and fearful. He wanted to see Halibel again but was still full of doubt about her. But he knew that he had to get the truth, and that if Halibel was indeed his enemy, he'd be ready for a fight. Grabbing the combat pass Captain Yukitake gave him, he popped out of his human body and shot through the air towards the mountain that had his training ground. Walking through the forest up to the spot, Ichigo's heart pounded in his chest. He'd so many questions for her. Was she really his friend? Was she training him on Aizen's orders? How much did the man know about them? And most importantly, what was Ichigo to her? The feelings of anxiety and fear reached a crescendo when he reached the spot. There, sitting on a stump with her back to him, was Halibel. The woman's ears perked when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, the woman smiled behind her mask to see Ichigo alive and well. "You came back," she said softly as she walked towards him. "I promise, didn't I?" Ichigo couldn't help but grinned. Before Halibel could get too close, Ichigo held up a hand to stop her. "Wait." Halibel stopped and saw the determined expression on Ichigo's face. She nodded, knowing what was on Ichigo's mind. "I suppose everything has become much more complicated, hasn't it?" she said coyly. "You and I stand on opposite sides of a growing war. Halibel, be straight with me. Do you work for Aizen?" "I do," Halibel replied, much to Ichigo's dismay. "He is my master. I serve as one of his elite warriors. It was he who saved me and my friends and turned us into Arankars to give us greater power." The boy could feel his heart sink at her words. He'd hoped that Halibel had nothing to do with Aizen. Looking at the ground, Ichigo sighed. "Halibel, tell me, why did you train me? Was it because of Aizen?" "No," Halibel answered adamantly. "I swear to you, Ichigo, Aizen has nothing to do with this. With us. Then how does he know about us? He practically shouted it to me on the Sokyoku Hill," he pointed out. Halibel hesitated, looking away. I don't know. Aizen visits Hueco Mundo in secret, but I've told him nothing about you. I'd no idea he knew about us until..." Ichigo saw the sad look in her eyes. "What happened?" "After he returned to Hueco Mundo, he called for me." Halibel's heels clicked against the black tiled floor as she entered the throne room. She was surprised to see how empty it was. Usually there was a score of newly created Arankars gathered whenever Halibel arrived. Though it would be inaccurate to say that the throne room was completely empty. Sitting on the throne was Sasuke Aizen. He'd shed his Haori for a white overcoat and had discarded his glasses, showing off a bolder image that suited his charismatic personality. "Good evening, Halibel," Aizen greeted as Halibel took a knee. "I see you've been training hard." "Yes, my lord," Halibel replied. "My Frashens and I have been working diligently every day in preparation." "That is quite good to hear." Aizen rested his head on his hand and gave her a knowing smile. "And what of Ichigo? He has benefited well from your training, has he not?" "Yes, Halibel's eyes widened in horror when she realized just what Aizen had said. She looked up and saw the smile on Aizen's face, knowing her secret was out. "My lord, I don't." "Don't what?" Aizen asked. "Know what I'm talking about? Perhaps this will refresh your memory." He snapped his fingers and an image formed on one of the walls below his throne. Halibel stared in disbelief at the sight of her and Ichigo having sex. She knew that she'd been busted in the worst of ways. "My lord," she dropped to her knee again and prayed that Aizen wouldn't kill her then and there for treachery. "I can explain." "There's no need," Aizen said. "I'm not mad. In fact, I'm rather impressed. Under 2 months of your tutelage Ichigo Kurosaki has grown quite remarkably. Imagine his growth if he was here where you could train him properly." The Espada blinked. "My lord." Aizen stood up and smiled down at Halibel, his eyes a mystery. "When you next meet him, bring him to me. You have his trust. Failing that, bring him by force." "I will persuade him into joining our cause," he said, his malicious intent clear. "Yes, Lord Aizen," Halibel said before quickly leaving, her mind filled with terror. Ichigo listened to Halibel's story, stunned at the knowledge that Aizen knew how intimate they were. He also noticed that Halibel's hands were trembling. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his hand twitching, ready to grab for Zangetsu if Halibel decided to carry out Aizen's orders. Walking away from Ichigo, Halibel stood next to a stump, her hand tracing the rings. "I don't want to," she admitted. "I do not want to think of what Lord Aizen has planned for you." She turned back to Ichigo with sadness in her eyes. "You asked me once why I wanted to train you, did you not?" "Yeah." Turning back to the stump, Halibel continued to trace the rings, her thoughts clouded with her own insecurities. "I am strong. There are those who are stronger than me, but I detest them. I wanted someone who could walk beside me, who could be my friend and perhaps more." She turned back to Ichigo. Even though her face was covered, he knew she was smiling lovingly at him. "I found you." She finally shook her head. "I will not bring you to Lord Aizen. Even if we are enemies, I cannot let you fall into his hands." What he's done to my fellow hollows, she shivered as she remembered some of Aizen's experiments. What are you going to do? Ichigo asked. He was relieved to hear that Halibel wouldn't drag him to Aizen, but he was afraid of what would happen if she showed up in Hueco Mundo empty-handed. As Halibel sat down on the stump, he noticed that she was trembling again. Halibel, what's wrong? Despite being so calm and level-headed, Halibel couldn't hide her fear. Something has happened. I do not know how it happened, but... Ichigo walked over to Halibel and crouched down, taking hold of Halibel's trembling hand. He'd never seen her so scared before. Halibel, what is it? If you can't go back to Hueco Mundo, you can stay here. No, that is not why I am terrified. Then what is it? The blonde Arrancar was silent, staring off in the distance for a moment before turning back again to face Ichigo. She then said 3 words. Just 3 words that would forever change Ichigo's world. Ichigo, I'm pregnant. Chapter 15. Ichigo and Halibel's training ground. With one sentence, Ichigo's blood turned to ice. His brain came to a screeching halt as it tried to process what Halibel just told him. His legs suddenly wobbled as he struggled to stand. He sat down on the stump and tried to control his breathing, his eyes wide with shock. Halibel was pregnant. Controlling his breathing, Ichigo looked at Halibel. For the first time in his life, he saw his mentor with fear in her eyes. He knew from the look on her face that this was no lie, there was no deception in her eyes. Are you sure? He managed to say, his voice a whisper. The Arrancar nodded. I am. I started to vomit when I woke up in the morning. No easy task to do when your face is covered, she lamented, pointing to her mask fragment. But more importantly than that, she grabbed Ichigo's hand and put it over her stomach. Feel. As his fingers brushed her smooth belly, Ichigo closed his eyes and concentrated. For a moment, he sensed nothing from the Arrancar at all. Then, bah bump, Ichigo froze again. He knew what he felt within Halibel, a second heartbeat. It was true, Halibel was carrying his child. He turned away, unsure of what to say. Like Halibel, he was afraid. It was bad enough that he had been trained by one of Aizen's soldiers, but now she was carrying his child. What would everyone say when they found out? I can't hide this. Not forever. He turned back to Halibel and reached out to grab her hand. The blonde squeezed Ichigo's hand gently. She knew that it was a huge bomb to drop on him, but he needed to know. She was unaccustomed to fear and dread, but now all she could feel was the foreign sensation of terror. She'd never heard of an Arrancar becoming pregnant. She didn't even think she could become pregnant in the first place. It was a hard fact to counter considering there was a giant hole in her womb. What are you going to do? Ichigo asked before he changed his question. What are we going to do? He'd hoped that Halibel wouldn't do something desperate and drag Ichigo to Aizen to save herself from her master's wrath. Halibel hung her head. I don't know, she admitted. It was bad enough that she was caught red-handed having intercourse with her enemy. Now she was carrying his child. I cannot return to Hueco Mundo, she finally said. If I return without you, Lord Aizen will punish me. And if he finds out I'm with child, Halibel couldn't finish the sentence. She knew what her master was capable of. She'd witnessed several of Aizen's experiments with hollowification. If he knew that Halibel had Ichigo's child within her, then there was no doubt he'd perform all kinds of twisted experiments on the baby. Does he know? Ichigo asked. I do not know for certain. Although since he knew of your training, it stands to reason he'll put 2 and 2 together sooner or later. But if I return without you, I'll have to give up the child or risk punishment. Ichigo touched her cheek and turned her head to face him. Halibel, you can't go back to him. I know, Halibel said. She knew that it was a huge sacrifice, to give up her position as an espada for the sake of both Ichigo and their unborn child. But Halibel was rather familiar with sacrifice. But where can I go? There is nowhere that is safe for me. You can stay here, with me, Ichigo insisted. How? Halibel asked. Getting up. Ichigo thought hard about his next move, knowing that he was walking on thin ice. He knew the one person that he could go to for help, but the consequence would be exposing his friendship to Halibel. But when he turned back and stared into her emerald eyes and thought of their child, Ichigo knew it was time to face the music. There's someone who might be able to help us. Later, Urahara shop. Kazuki sat in a rocking chair and watched the sun go down. Yoruichi lay in his lap, returned to her black cat form for now. They'd discussed much about what had happened in the Soul Society, particularly Ichigo's bracelet. "And you're sure?" Kazuki asked. "Definitely. The jewel in the middle was a communication device. But that was all I could figure out. I didn't have time to further examine it while I was training Ichigo." The shopkeeper tilted his hat back and hummed. "So Mr. Kurosaki has some secrets. Perhaps we should keep a closer eye on him." Yoruichi raised her head and stared off at the side of the street in disbelief. "I don't think that'll be necessary." "Really? How so?" "Look to your left." Turning his head, the shopkeeper was baffled when he saw his protege approach the shop. Beside him was a woman clad in white, with blonde hair and mocha dark skin. Though the front of her face was covered, Kazuki recognized the bits of hollow mask peeking through. "Is that what I think it is?" he gaped. Keeping hold of Halibel's hand, Ichigo gulped. "Kazuki, we need your help." The shopkeeper was caught off guard but only for an instant. Setting Yoruichi on the ground, the bucket hat wearing Soul Reaper narrowed his eyes and pointed into the shop. "You've some explaining to do, Mr. Kurosaki," he said with angry eyes. Ichigo was starting to regret his decision already. Minutes later, Kazuki's living room. "I see," Kazuki said after Ichigo confessed to everything. Beside him sat Yoruichi and Tessai, both staring at Ichigo's companion with caution's looks. Halibel, knowing their distrust, merely sat next to Ichigo in silence, her zanpakuto on the table where the others could see it. "Well, suddenly everything adds up. We were wondering how you were so strong to begin with," Kazuki said, his tone uncharacteristically low. "And that would explain your smell." "Smell?" Yoruichi piped in. "You can't smell it, Ichigo, since your senses aren't as honed as ours. But to the three of us, you reek of hollow. But more importantly, Ichigo, this complicates things," Kazuki said. Flipping his fan, he hid his face behind it and stared deeply at Ichigo. "How do you think the 13 court guard squad's going to respond to this?" "Kazuki, I have nothing to do with Aizen," Ichigo insisted. "He is telling you the truth," Halibel added. "My decision to train Ichigo was my own. Sasuke Aizen had nothing to do with this." Sitting back on his cushion, Kazuki simply glared at Halibel from behind his fan. "As much as I'd like to believe that, I'm afraid that your word carries little weight." When Kazuki brought his gaze back to Ichigo, the boy shivered from his scrupulous gaze. "You don't trust me?" Ichigo asked. "In a nutshell, no, I don't." Flipping his fan shut, Kazuki took off his hat. "Quite frankly, Mr. Kurosaki, I'm a bit disappointed." Tessai coughed. "Ichigo, this is serious. You have a connection with a hollow. And one of our enemy's soldiers at that. Add into the fact that she's carrying your child and you've a recipe for disaster. There's no way the head captain and the others won't find out about this. And even if you two are telling the truth, they will consider your judgment compromised by her. You should have told us about her straight away, Ichigo," Kazuki said in an angry tone. "You might have had your reasons, but it's never a good idea to keep secrets when you're asking for help." Yoruichi turned and was a little put off by Kazuki's angry face. It was a bit out of character for him. "Kazuki, aren't you being a little harsh?" Ichigo balled his hands into fists as anger rose inside of him. If Kazuki was going to be abrasive, Ichigo could do it too. "Keep secrets, like you, Mr. Former Captain," he retorted. "Considering half the things you forgot to tell me before I went to the Soul Society, I think I was right to not tell you." Kazuki nodded. "Yes, Ichigo, I withheld certain information from you. You weren't ready at the time and the clock was ticking, however. But before you accuse me of lying, answer me this. If I had told you what I'd left out back then, would you still have wanted to save Rukia?" "Of course, I'd have saved Rukia no matter what," Ichigo shouted. "What would you have done if you'd known about Halibel?" he asked. "I'd have let you die in the street where Byakuya Kuchiki left you." Both Yoruichi and Tessai looked at Kazuki appalled. "Boss, you can't mean that," Tessai insisted. "You're being too harsh on Ichigo." Yoruichi turned to face Halibel. He might have kept her a secret, but that's only because he cared about her, not because he was being manipulated by Aizen. But Kazuki held up a hand and silenced the two before addressing Ichigo. "I am upset, Ichigo. Let me tell you why, so that there is no misunderstanding between the two of us. Kazuki reached for the table and grabbed a hot cup of tea. Looking down at his murky reflection, he paused to remember better times. As you know, I was a captain in the Soul Society. So was Yoruichi. Tessai was the head of the Kido Corp. As well. We had friends, family, men whom we looked after and comrades whom we valued. Then in one night, Aizen took that from us. Our lives have been forever ruined because of him. His scheming led to so many of our friends suffering and we were left to flee after we were tried on trumped-up charges because of him. And in that 100 years of absence that man has had free rein to do as he pleases. It's not that I'm angry that you kept your friendship to this woman from us. It's that I can no longer trust you, which has me so upset. You have the capabilities to surpass many of the captains. Your strength will be a vital asset in the battles to come. But now we cannot have faith in you anymore. The hard truth of the matter is that you are compromised. His face softened and he calmed down a little. You two might be telling the truth about Aizen. If I wanted, I could use several interrogative techniques to ascertain the truth from you, Ichigo, but I believe you when you say you had no knowledge about Aizen. But the truth is that it makes little difference. The way Aizen operates makes me question everything. Sure, you two had no knowledge of him knowing about you being together, but for all we know this could be some part of some bigger scheme. If he knows about you two, then he knows about your child. Now that you've not one but two people in danger of his reach, Ichigo, you're vulnerable to him. This makes it hard for me to want to help you, Ichigo. Because helping you now might help Aizen later on. Finally, he sighed and sipped his tea. Halibel had held her peace long enough. She pointed an accusing finger at the shopkeeper. You claim that your hand would not have affected the outcome, Kazuki Urahara. That is a lie and you know it, she said. Excuse me, Kazuki blinked. It feels a little hypocritical, don't you think? Halibel subjected. You only do things when you're forced to. The fact that you don't act until the very last moment makes you as much responsible for this as much as Aizen. How do you mean? Kazuki asked curiously. Your goal in putting the Hogyoku inside of Rukia Kuchiki was to keep it hidden. You knew that Aizen would want it and that letting Byakuya Kuchiki take her away would only let it fall into his hands. You could have stopped them yourself. Instead you held back and let Ichigo do the fighting and only intervened when he lost. Furthermore, if getting the Hogyoku back was such a priority, then why didn't you go with him instead of leaving him ill-prepared for a suicide mission? Both Yoruichi and Tessai were forced to nod at Halibel's logic, noting how sharp the Arrancar was. Scratching his stubble, Kazuki knew that the woman had him there. Touché, I guess. You're quite the sharp one. The shopkeeper stood up. Maybe you've a point. Then you'll help us. We'll keep quiet about this for now. In the meantime, I'll create a gigai for your friend here. Yoruichi and Tessai can fetch her some clothes. She'll have to stay with you at your place, Ichigo. Yoruichi grinned. Taking a good look at Ichigo's friend, she understood very well why Ichigo was so enamored with her. Especially taking into account her assets. I bet your dad will love this, she chuckled. The three Soul Reapers left, leaving Ichigo and Halibel alone. Ichigo breathed a sigh of relief. That almost got ugly, he said. Thanks for sticking up for me. You've done enough for me. It was the least I could do. Halibel reached for Ichigo's hand and squeezed it gently. Thank you, Ichigo. I know what a burden this all is for you. You're my friend, Halibel. I don't abandon my friends. Behind her mask, Halibel smiled lovingly.